Alright, my friends, this is Rick, and this is actually going to be my second attempt at this video today. I spent last weekend trying to recreate my intros and to somehow figure out how to lower the volume on them. And by my standards, with just listening to it blaring here, I don't know how to do it. I'll just have to keep fiddling with it. If nothing else, I'll try to find something that's much less jarring to start out with. I like stuff that has a little bit of pep to it, and not something that's immediately wanting to tell you to nap time. And with working with the free stuff, there's a limit to what I can get, but it's not because I'm not trying. I apologize for that, but it just seems to me to be just as loud as it was before. Anyway, so my topic today is the daughters of men, the various creation mythologies, and my literal thoughts on them. All right, let's have a discussion. Let's talk and discuss what we think and what we wonder and how this stuff may or may not have occurred. So when we're talking about gods taking wives or aliens in the guise of gods, Greek myth, Norse legend, African Indian folklore, Judaism, it's just not coming out, and Christian biblical stories. That is my just a little bit of dyslexia going on there. Anyway, the world is full of these stories, these myths of humanity, some powerful uber being or beings interacting with humans, either on a genetic level, and just depending on how they do so, whether they're directly interfering in some magical seeming way, imprinting DNA, enhancing DNA, genetic manipulation, or they're physically interbreeding with humans, and with either the intention of producing a more advanced human or accidentally doing so. But the stories are all similar. There's a lot of similarity. Now, of course, let's be straightforward fact about the plagiarism of the history. So most historians and histories that came after the fact looked at the stuff that came before them and often stole, borrowed, or retooled existing folklore to suit their needs, whether it's from religious perspective or social perspective, or a leadership imposing more control on their people, or just the fact that humans have a tendency, a need to have something bigger or better or different in their past, and are natural storytellers, and we have a tendency to exaggerate and enhance. And then over time, because the majority of the stories from the ancient world would have been passed down hand to mouth through music and through song and through oration, until eventually somebody started putting them down in writing, whether they were doing them crude pictograph paintings on walls or carving them into stone or mud tablets. The fact of the matter is, that's human nature, plagiarism. So I'll go to the Bible. It says the Nephilian, Nephilian, were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. That is Genesis 6:4. So, first off, they're suggesting that there was some race on the planet in those days and afterwards. So they stuck around. So if we look at the Adam and Eve story, God creates Adam, he creates Eden, he created the world, but not necessarily in that order. And then if you go from the various divergence, Adam's first wife was Lilith. And Lilith didn't turn out to be such a hot wife, or she had a whole lot of she was just too independent. She had her own mind and her own purpose, and she wanted to do stuff, etc., etc. And then she's replaced by Eve. She's tossed out of Lilith is tossed out of Eden, replaced by Eve, who then also gets Adam and herself both tossed out of Eden. We're not going to go into that, but point was that there were maybe several attempts going on here. But if you look at it from a modern or sci-fi mindset, Eden almost sounds like a biodome. It sounds like this controlled environment, this perfect perfect location where there's not too much sun, there's not too much rain, it's not too much, it's not too hot, it's not too cold. These people are running around butt naked, so they have to be able to handle the environment quite well. Everything in here is edible. Nothing in here will eat them, bite them, sting them, make them sick, etc., etc. Yes, you can argue that the snake was there, but you know that's not what the snake didn't bite them. They didn't eat the snake. That's a different kind of parable that they're using. But literal sense, the literal sense is everything in Eden is benign to the humans. So the humans are put in this fishbowl by God and genetically manipulated to a point. And then they cross this threshold of the you can have everything, do everything, just don't do this one thing. And they do it anyway, and out the door they go. This could have also been intentional. Lots of people, depending on who you are, blame Eve for a lot of this. But what if it was intentional? What if it was set up? Don't push the red button. The natural curiosity of a person, even a chimpanzee for that matter, is going to want to push the big red button. So at one point, the God wants them to leave Eden. He really didn't intend for them to spend their entire existence as specimens in a fishbowl. He wanted them to go out and procreate and populate the world, which brings us to the other part of the particular equation. Is their two oldest sons, Cain and Abel. And we're not talking about, Cain and Abel or so-and-so kills so-and-so, etc., etc. My concern is, okay, Adam and Eve leaves Eden. They're thrown out, what have you. They then have children. And they have more than just Cain and Abel. They have many children. And their children grow up. So who do their children marry? If Adam and Eve were the first man and a woman on the earth, who do they marry? See, it gets murky at that point. My grandfather was a fire and brimstone kind of preacher for 50 years of his life, had his own little church. Would throw Bibles at his grandchildren if they fell asleep in the pews. I know this because I'm one of them. And he always danced around this question, but he was honest about it. He said, there may have been other people in the world. God is going to take that into account. God's going to populate the world. He said so. Whether or not these are the ancestors of the Neanderthals or whatever, the latest generic, the next step below the standard human, wherever that stock pool came from, or something he created outside the fact. Because he also was dodging around the other side of that question. Because it's implied it says right in the Bible, or it's implied in the Bible, that they marry their sister and their wives. So basically, it's incest all over the place. If Adam and Eve are the first man and woman to walk the planet, and it's their prodigy that we are all descended from, and perhaps Genghis Khan, depending on who you ask, then they had to do something. That means Adam and Eve had many, many children, probably scores of them, dozens of them. And they took wives and husbands among themselves, because how else can they procreate? It's just what it is, right? Now, what we know from genetics today, or what I've read up on stuff of this nature, is that in order for a successful breeding pool to thrive and not have so many deformities and defects to cause it to potentially stagger and die out, is you need about 400 to 5,000 mating individuals. So we need 400 to 5,000 humans. After that point, our genetic pool is going to be diffuse enough to be that we're going to be thriving, successful, and unless something else interferes, we're going to continue to procreate and grow. If our numbers, if the end of the world happens tomorrow and the world population is reduced to the point where it's less than 400 people, humanity's screwed. In the long run, humanity's going to, it's the slow road to non-existence. Because we see that in endangered species all the time. That's the cruel hard facts of the way things work, unless you live in a world where you don't buy slams. And all these people did all this work for nothing. Okay, so it's not just here though. Like I said, Greek myth, North myth, North legend, folklore, blah 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 blah. It's all there. So we look at the biblical creation story. God creates Adam and Eve. He kicks them out of Eden. They start to breed. because, perhaps while they're in Eden, and we don't know how long they were in Eden, and they surely didn't have stories about them having their first child in Eden. So it wasn't until after they left Eden that they start procreating, or they were procreating before, which I tend to believe because humans are humans. Naked humans are naked humans, and or something was preventing them or telling them not to do that. Once they get out of Eden, it's on, and they produce numerous children. And from these children, more human beings descend, whether they're directly from breeding amongst themselves or from having access to another gene pool outside. We know Lilith, if you go by the story, Lilith was there. Now she's outside. Lilith's out there somewhere. What's the maybe one of them picked, I'd buy into more that if one of them somehow or another got hooked up with Lilith, because now we have a separate genetic, within 3 gene pool thing to work with Lilith, Eve, and Adam. Anyway, another consideration when we talk about the ancient texts in the Bible, when we're talking, and I think this is connected all to this for a reason, because there's this section in there called, in Genesis where so and so begot so and so begot so and so begot. So what we're trying is to establish this long-term gene pool and how it's established. And from them, more and more and more children and human beings are created. So we get to a point where we're looking at Noah, and there's huge amounts of people out there that are going to die in a flood. We talk about Adam and going to, or not Adam, but Abraham, and we talk about Moses going to Egypt and so on and so forth. So there's millions of people out there at some point in pretty fast order in the line of progression when it comes to time. Of course, once again, time is a relative thing. We keep time today based off of some convention, roughly back in Rome or in Caesar's day, when they decided this is going to be the 12-month calendar, the 365 days, 24 hours in a day, etc., etc. So at some point we've formalized all this. So we don't know what and how they kept back then, which can cause issues. So when I talk about that, it says Adam and Eve lived to be about 930 years old. Now, if that's a lunar calendar, that'd be 930 lunar passes or months. Well, then you're talking about 60, 70 years old, something like that. And I'm not going to crunch the numbers, but it's still quite respective of an age, because at the time, even up until recent modern times, life expectancy was pretty low. People were lucky if they lived to be 40. They were considered an old and venerable by 40. And most people, as soon as they were able, especially when it came to the young girls, as soon as they were able to produce, they were married off. It was very common up until recent times for 12 and 13-year-old girls to be married to whatever. And this was to get them a running chance, because the odds were not in their favor. They were going to die of childbirth. They were going to die of malnutrition. They were going to die of illness. They were going to die of accidents and mishaps and abuse, and et cetera, et cetera. And the men the same way. So the fact that these stories of these various people living hundreds of years, in a monthly matter, is kind of acceptable. But I'm looking at the literally. So literally, they lived to be 930 years old. So it says Jared, Enoch's father, lived to be 962. Enoch himself only lived to be 365, but his son Methuselah, Methuselah, lives to be 969 years old. Abraham, of the Ten Commandments fame, was 175 years old and was still having children at that age. So the story says Enoch, son of Jared, and father of Methuselah. So we got these people who have really long lives. Now, if you were a genetic manipulative individual or a race or species, let's just talk about it. Let's say the aliens come down and they start messing with the human genetics, and they want to enhance the existing human stock. And we're going to get to that in a little bit here too, about, I think, how and why. So something intervenes, and some powerful or some event intervenes and enhances humanity to become what's the progenitors of the modern human being. Things have changed. To give these individuals at the very beginning, who potentially share the God's bloodline, Just like longer lives makes perfectly good sense. If you look at the story from Lord of the Rings, Aragorn is a son. Aragorn is a descendant of Númenor, and back in the day, the Númenorians were able to have a life expectancy upwards of 500 years, and this was partly a gift from the gods for their servitude and hard work and sacrifices in the first stage and helping the elves fight the dark enemy. So this makes them an advanced version of man. It's the Tolkien's version of Atlantis story, and the great ultimate ending descendant Aragorn lives to be several hundred years old because he has his bloodline is unbroken from the old days. So his father married into another Numerian, etc., etc. They didn't diminish the bloodline, and so he retains this extraordinarily long life compared to the normal humans around him who rarely live to be 50 or 60. So there you have that. It's the same similar comparison here. If you need to repopulate or populate, and I'm going to look at it from a repopulation event, modern human beings into the world, you need them to be able to procreate and do a lot of it. So if you have beings that people who can live to be 300 or 400 years old or more, how many generations of children would that mean? I mean, we talk about, like I said, Adam and Eve lived to be 930. Perhaps let's just say that they're 30 when they leave the Garden of Eden, when they're kicked out. So 900 years. If every year they had one child, that's 900 children. And if those 900 of those 900 children, it's an even mix of girls and boys, and they hook up and they each have children, and they each live to be 900 years old. There's another 1,800. Now we got 2,700, and so on and so on, and then it starts to expedite it quite fast. I mean, it's non-realistic by even fantasy standards, but that's the plausible storyline here if you look at it from the literal sense of the word. So, human beings that come out of this descent of Adam and Eve, who lived to be extremely old, and so that there's so much population going on. It seems like the world has far more population in it. When the stories of Abraham talking about entire countries of millions of people, you know, Egypt and the Far East, etc., etc. And we're not even talking to people who are in other other portions of the planet, which also leads to the repopulate the planet theory. What if a number of these Eden events take place at the same time in different parts of the world in order to save humanity from the massive flood that's going to wreak havoc, or in the process of doing it? If you have the means to observe the world and its events from above, and this is one way of helping mitigate the outcome. So that potentially there might have been advanced societies before the Great Flood period. And if we're talking just pure humans, the Atlanteans and the East Indian equivalent of them saw the end was coming for humanity and acted upon it and did everything they could to help humanity survive and then reestablish itself. And in doing so, it's hubris or natural inclination to go ahead and make more, add to this, enhance these people so that they will even be more proficient and better and smarter and clever, etc. So we get to the Anunnaki thread. There's also a Babylonian creation myth, and is it the Umna Alice, I believe. In the Anunnaki thread, God's purposely imprinting their DNA upon humans and then carrying them in their wombs is the cutaway of the whole spiel, as best I can tell. I've read some of it. I've listened to a number of videos from different sources. I read a lot of Stitchin's books, and I took those as science fiction, even if they're based in fact, or in some version of facts. But some alien species comes to the planet, discovers that the existing Neanderthal-style people are just not quick or savvy enough or proficient enough for their needs, so they set out to enhance them, i.e. genetically manipulate them. So how do they do this? They take the genetics from their own people and spice them into the existing genetics of the humans that are here and create an advanced human being, in our case the modern humans that we are all part of. And this is their creation story in a nutshell. And it's quite feasible, quite theoretically, very scientifically plausible. If these people even have an inkling of better, if the Anunnaki's technological level was on par with what we are today, or say a couple hundred years in the future from today, and they come amongst our ancient ancestors who are hunter-gatherers for the most part, it's going to be very easy for them to scoop some up, do some experimenting on, and catch and release. Catch, manipulate, and release. There you have it. So, I'm not going to get into the whole Anunnaki thing because it's pretty well established, and I have opinions on it and stuff, and might be good for a different video. And I'm trying to keep this video from running too effing long. So I want to get to let's just call it an evolution of ideas and concepts, and why 12,000 BC was such a crucial point from what everybody seems to be saying, in my opinion. It's estimated that humanity discovered the use of fire 1.7 to 2 million years ago. 2 million years, pretty much 2 million years before the modern era. The idea here is just take a moment and think of what that means. You know, the ancient ancestors of humans must have been running from fires and dying from fires since the get-go, because forest fires and grass fires happen, and they happen naturally from lightning bolts and other things and set them off. And then suddenly the whole countryside's on fire, and everything's running away, and you better run away too, or you're not going to live through it. Actually controlling and using fire as a tool, that is a lot more, there's a lot more steps involved than what it sounds like. Yeah, okay, so after the fire, there's still some burning stuff. Somebody goes over and picks up a burning branch, and they discover, oh, it's warm. Ouch, it burns. Oh, we can do stuff with it. It's a gradual thing. Oh, it went out. Then what? To discover fire is to imply to control fire, is what it should say. It shouldn't say with discovering fire. They discovered fire when they were still apes. Just the truth. It burns, it's horrible, run away. Smoke, the stuff it produces will kill you, go away. Understanding fire, controlling fire. 1.72 million years ago, we learned to control it. So at some point, somebody figured out how to generate an artificial spark, rather by clanging two types of rock, and they had to figure out that not all rock do it. So they had to figure out just what kind of rock can be smacked against another rock to create a spark. Just like rubbing two sticks together. Either some goober was sitting there screwing around one day right next to the cook fire, or by the cook fire, or by the tribal whatever, and was rubbing two sticks together out of some God knows what reason, and it got so hot that it set something on fire. What a revelation. What an epiphany. The question is, can we do it twice? Second is how do you get that spark to catch on to something? Well, we've tried to, all the time we keep bringing wet stuff in, the wet stuff won't burn. We discovered dry grass burns and they're hairy. Now we start to understand the concept of tinder, and we improve on it. See how this is an evolution. This is how this takes many small baby steps to become proficient in controlling fire, knowing not to put too much stuff on the fire so it ends up burning the entire neighborhood, and placing it in such a way that if you're using a cave for shelter, that you don't suffocate. And just how many people might have done just that? Or are we keeping the ground around it swept enough or cleaned away from it enough that starting an open fire in an open dry field is probably a bad idea, especially if it's windy. All these are evolutions. So, okay, roughly 2 million years ago. So sometime about 12,000 BC, or 14,000 years ago, it's implied, right about the time the last ice age breaks up and the big flood's about to happen, we discover farming. About 12,000 years ago, we discover the use of domestic animals. I imagine we've been using animals for millions of years. Look at the dogs in a semi-domestic capacity, but we're actually finding husbandry is what they're really talking about, the management of animals, and we're discovering what animals are manageable. There's lots of them are not. If you want to have a herd of tigers, you're going to find yourself in a problem, because the tigers are going to kill each other and then try to kill you. Or not necessarily in that same manner. And there's no domesticating them unless somehow you find you can get a venue in Las Vegas. So about 10,000 years ago, they start settling and creating communities. We've already got the hunter-gatherers about 12,000 BC, 14,000 years ago, start settling down and creating farms and are not migrating nearly as much as often, so they're beginning to turned away from the hunting gathering to agriculture, which truth is agriculture is far more harder to do and maintain and be successful at than being a hunter-gatherer, because if you hunt your prey out, you move where there's new prey. There's a reason why up until modern times, Native Americans in the plains migrated. They followed the herds. That's the reason why the same in the far north of the northern tribes would tend to follow the elk herds, because that's their source of food and supplies. Settling down in one spot, it was a lot more work to do than just following your food source around, and so on and so forth. So from this agriculture and this husbandry, we start to develop fixed locations and discover other groups of people doing the same thing, and we combine together into social networks, which form towns and villages, and which allows for some beginning of specialization. All this from the last 12,000 years, 12 to 10,000 years. Then, someplace about 7,000 years ago, we start becoming proficient in metallurgy. We start discovering that we can not only combine elements together to make better metals, but we can create all kinds of tools, and tools to make more tools, tools to do jobs better, tools to kill people faster, etc., etc., etc. And it took us about 7,000 years. So at this point, we've known knowledge of fire for 2,000. We've started agriculture and farming and husbandry, and we've created towns, potentially small, villages and towns and other social networks. And then we discover metal tools roughly 7,000 years ago, which then goes to be about 3,500 BC or 5,500 years ago. We discovered the concept of the wheel. And let's look at the wheel. I always find it kind of funny, because we have a tendency to talk about, all the certain aspects of something. So in this pandemic, everybody goes, yeah, the restaurants are closed. The restaurants are closed. All those poor restaurant people are suffering. You're damn straight they're suffering. And guess what? There's a whole set of industries that support restaurants that are also suffering. My company services restaurants, and we service a lot of other places too, but about 50 to 60% of our business is restaurants. And so that meant we've lost a lot of business this last year, and we are struggling. And I know a lot of other companies, little outfits. I'll give an example. One restaurant I go every Friday or every other Friday, and I clean their grease trap. It takes me about 10 minutes to get in and out. When I'm there, this other fellow shows up to clean their windows. A third guy shows up from a vendor to drop off the week's supplies for the restaurant. Sometimes the beer guy shows up. It's all about that same thing. So now look, there's 6, 7, 8 different entities who are helping to service and bring services and material resources to this restaurant. So if this restaurant shuts its doors, that's one less restaurant we have as a customer. And so does all these other places. So everybody's connected. And if you don't think it affects you in your own little world, you just have to expand on that restaurant. If that restaurant can't function, and those dozen or so companies that service that restaurant have a diminished production, many of those companies rely on other companies to provide things like advertising, for information, for computer hardware and software, and on and on and on. So at some point, you're connected to my connection in some way, because we're all interconnected. This is something that our ancestors started to develop 10 to 12,000 years ago. In and of itself seems simple, but it's actually quite a complex and convoluted concept. So about 3,500 years ago, which is 3,500 BC, 5,500 years ago, they invent the wheel. And like I said, they never talk about inventing the axle, because without the axle, you have the wheel is pointless. You have this round thing. You're going to push this round thing around. You can't put nothing on it and push it, because to do so means it's going to hit the ground and either damage whatever you put on it or stop your wheel from moving. So instead, we invented this thing that goes in the middle of the wheel that lets the wheel go round and round. And on and on and on it goes. So there you have it. About 14,000 years ago, 12,000 BC, a number of major things happened. There's this massive floods. The world's dynamics change. Lots of coastline disappears. The ecology changes. The climate changes. suddenly there's this whole litany of creation myths where some god or gods or beings unknown interfere with human development, and in the process, we benefit greatly from it. We come out of this better, smarter, quicker, what have you. Think of it what you will. Till next time, this is Rick, and have a good day.